The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines. It was a cold October night in 1984, deep inside Virginia's old state penitentiary. The electric chair room stood silent, its wires humming softly under the harsh lights. Linwood Briley, a man with tattoos curling up his arms, a snake coiled forever in his mind, sat strapped in, staring straight ahead with a chilling calm. The guards flipped the switches. Then came the first jolt. His body convulsed, his fists clenched, and when the second surge hit, his face contorted, but he didn't scream. Witnesses later described him as resolute, unmoving. Minutes later, at 11:05 p.m., the doctor pronounced him dead. His last words? "I am innocent. UPI +2, Murderpedia +2. That was just the first shock. Not the only one. Over the next 3 decades, dozens more notorious inmates would meet their end in Virginia, not in far-flung prisons, but right here, in this Commonwealth. Men and one woman, who committed brutal crimes, who escaped, who struck fear in their communities, and all of them ended in the same place. But what drives a person to such darkness? And how did Virginia, a state with one of the longest and bloodiest execution records in America, finally move to end it all? By the end of this video, you'll understand not just who these death row inmates were, but what their final moments reveal about justice, mercy, and the weight of a life lost forever. So let's rewind and go back to where it all began. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. It was the evening of October 12, 1984, when Linwood Earl Briley, a man condemned to die, walked into the execution chamber of Virginia State Penitentiary. The room was silent, tense, and grim. Guards flanked him on all sides, and the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present. His hands were strapped down, a mask pressed to his face, electrodes attached. A chaplain stood nearby, ready to provide solace, though Linwood declined a clergy escort. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and fear. At 11:03 p.m., the switch was thrown. The first surge of electricity hit. Linwood's body tensed, then slackened. The room held its collective breath. Then came the second surge, stronger and more final. For 55 seconds, electricity coursed through him. And then, at 11:05 p.m., the prison physician declared Linwood Briley dead. In those final moments, he had claimed he was innocent. This moment marked the climax of a life defined by violence, terror, and audacity. Linwood, along with his brothers James and Anthony, had been at the center of a violent crime spree in Richmond, Virginia, during the late 1970s. Over the course of their rampage, they were linked to at least 11 murders, plus numerous robberies and rapes. Their crimes shocked the city, not only for their brutality, but for their seeming lack of conscience. Linwood's path into crime had started early. As a teenager, he shot and killed a neighbor, an older woman. Authorities said he later rationalized her death, claiming her heart condition meant she was going to die anyway. He was tried as a juvenile and convicted of manslaughter, serving just a year in a reform school. That early act of violence foreshadowed the horrors to come. By 1979, the Briley brothers were involved in a spree of killings, robberies, and sexual assaults. One of the most notorious incidents involved a disc jockey named Johnny G. Gallagher, whom Linwood kidnapped, robbed, and shot. James Briley was responsible for murdering Judy Barton and her 5-year-old son, Harvey, in a crime that left the community horrified. Over the months, the brothers left a trail of fear and destruction across Richmond. Their criminal lifestyle extended beyond the streets. The Briley home housed exotic and dangerous pets, including piranhas, boa constrictors, tarantulas, and Doberman pinschers. These animals became symbols of the brothers' twisted fascination with danger and violence. Their home, filled with these creatures, reflected the chaos and menace of their lives. Eventually, the law caught up with them. Linwood and James were convicted for their respective murders and sentenced to death. Anthony, their younger brother, received a life sentence for his involvement. The courts reviewed appeals and rejected them, cementing Linwood and James's fate on death row. While on death row, Linwood and James attempted a bold escape. On May 31st, 1984, 6 death row inmates broke out of the Mecklenburg Correctional Center. The Briley brothers were among them. Using a television wrapped in a blanket as a fake bomb, they tricked the guards into opening doors and walked out, disguised as officers. The audacity of the escape stunned authorities and the public alike. The manhunt that followed was massive. Authorities tracked the brothers for 19 days, finally apprehending them in Philadelphia. Their brief taste of freedom ended in capture and return to prison, where their execution dates loomed ever closer. The failed escape hardened public opinion against them and intensified the focus on their crimes. As Linwood's execution approached, he met with family and his attorney. He maintained his innocence to the end, steadfast in his claim that he had been wrongly convicted for some of the killings attributed to him. His composure never faltered, even as the final hours drew near. The day of his execution, all formalities were observed. Linwood entered the chamber quietly, the straps holding him in place, the electrodes attached. A mask covered his face, his final sight of the world obscured. The electricity surged through his body, ending the life of a man whose actions had terrorized a city and left a permanent mark on its history. Almost 6 months later, it was James Dyrrell Briley's turn. On April 18, 1985, he was led into the same electric chair. Unlike his brother, James smiled at the witnesses, asking, "Are you happy?" before the current began. He had been convicted for the murder of Judy Barton and her son, among others. The power surged through his body in 2 55-second blasts at 2,300 volts, and he was pronounced dead shortly after. James's final hours were spent with family and reflection. He had even married in prison, a small semblance of normalcy in a life defined by violence. Appeals to halt his execution were denied, and he accepted his fate with a mix of calm and defiance. His end marked the conclusion of the Briley brothers' reign of terror, though the scars they left on the community remained. The story of the Briley brothers is not just a tale of crime and punishment. It is a dark chapter in Virginia's history, reflecting the consequences of unchecked violence, the tension between justice and mercy, and the enduring impact on the families of victims and the broader community. The executions of Linwood and James Briley closed one chapter of this grim story, but the questions they left behind linger. How could brothers commit such horrific acts, and what drives a human being to take lives without remorse? From Linwood's final defiant claim of innocence to James's last question to witnesses, the Briley story is a stark reminder of the limits of justice, the power of crime to terrorize, and the chilling reality of death row in Virginia. Their actions, escape, recapture, and ultimate execution paint a vivid, unflinching portrait of crime and consequence, a portrait that continues to haunt Virginia decades later. Teresa Wilson Bean Lewis was born in Danville, Virginia, in 1969. She grew up in a world that was hard, marked by financial struggle and emotional instability. As she got older, she fell in with the wrong crowd, and life took a darker turn when she met her co-conspirators, a pair of men whom she believed would help her escape her troubles. In 2002, Teresa's life would change forever. Her husband, a soldier in the Army Reserve, had taken out a life insurance policy, not unusual when deployment loomed. Teresa saw it as an opportunity. She believed she could profit from the policy. But for that to work, she needed money, a lot of it. And so she came up with a terrible plan. She conspired with 2 men. The idea was simple but horrifying. They would kill her husband, and also her young stepson, so that she could collect the insurance money. And so they did. One night, the 2 men carried out the murders. Teresa's husband was shot, and her stepson was killed, too. The plan was cold and calculated, but also deeply personal. These were not strangers. These were her family. When the authorities investigated, they uncovered the full scheme. Teresa was arrested, along with her 2 accomplices. During the trial, the prosecution argued she had masterminded the plan for money. The defense insisted she had been manipulated and was not the one who pulled the trigger. The debate over her role would become central in later appeals. Was she a mastermind, or just a pawn? A jury found her guilty of capital murder, conspiracy, and other charges. In 2003, she was sentenced to death. Her case stirred intense public debate. People argued about her mental capacity. Some said she was mentally ill or had borderline intellectual functioning. Others pointed to her role in the conspiracy, arguing she had deliberately plotted the murders for financial gain. Every appeal she filed was denied. Her lawyers fought hard, raising questions about her mental state, but the courts remained firm. In the end, her execution was scheduled for September 23, 2010. Virginia prison officials prepared for lethal injection. By that time, inmates in the state could be executed either by electric chair or injection. Teresa did not choose the chair. She would die by injection. On the night of her execution, the prison was quiet. There were witnesses, prison officials, a spiritual advisor, and family members. Teresa was calm, or at least composed. In her final hours, she met with loved ones, said prayers, and prepared for what was coming. There was no grand confession, no dramatic last statement. She accepted her fate with a quiet resignation. When the injection began, she did not resist. The lethal chemicals entered her bloodstream. One by one, her vital signs faltered. At 12:22 a.m., she was pronounced dead. With her death, Virginia carried out the last execution of a woman in its history, at least in the modern era. Teresa Lewis's execution became a lightning rod for debate. Many questioned whether she should have been executed at all. Critics pointed to her mental capacity, arguing that she may not have fully understood the scheme she helped carry out. Others defended the verdict, saying that taking 2 lives for money is a crime deserving the severest punishment. Her case also highlighted larger issues about capital punishment in Virginia. The state had long carried out executions, more than most other states, and the system was deeply scrutinized, especially as questions about racial bias, mental health, and the fairness of death penalties resurfaced. Advocates for abolition used her case as evidence of the system's flaws, arguing that a woman like Teresa, with her background and mental state, should never have faced death. And then came a turning point, not for Teresa, but for the state. In 2021, Virginia abolished the death penalty entirely. While her case wasn't the only reason, it remained a powerful symbol for those who believed the ultimate punishment was wrong. The place where she died, Greensville Correctional Center, was once the site of many executions. Her execution marked both an end and a beginning. As the state moved away from capital punishment, Teresa Lewis's story lingered in public memory, not just as a criminal, but as a woman who walked a dark path, one paved by desperation, manipulation, and tragedy. Her final moments were not of violence or spectacle, but of quiet reflection. And in her death, she became one of the most controversial figures in Virginia's history of capital punishment. But the shadow of her case didn't end with her death. It raised hard questions. What does justice mean when the criminal is also a product of trauma? Can the state ever be fair when deciding who lives and who dies? And after decades of executions, could Virginia, once a leader in capital punishment, finally turn the page? It was a quiet evening on July 6, 2017, at Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia. William Morva, strapped to a gurney in the execution chamber, waited for his final moments. His hands and legs were secured, and an 4-line had been placed in his arm, ready for the lethal chemicals. He did not speak when asked if he had any last words, simply shaking his head. For many witnesses, it was a chilling scene. A man on the brink of death, composed yet silent, a life about to end under the state's authority. William Morva's story did not begin in that execution chamber. It began years earlier, in 2005, in Blacksburg, Virginia, where he was being held on attempted robbery charges. While under custody at a local hospital for an injured wrist and ankle, Morva seized an opportunity. He attacked a sheriff's deputy with a metal object, grabbed the officer's gun, and shot a security guard named Derek McFarland in the face. Then, in a shocking turn, he escaped. The next day, during a manhunt that gripped the region, Morva killed Corporal Eric Sutphin in the back of the head. He was no longer just an escaped inmate. He was now a murderer. The 2 deaths sent shockwaves through the community. Friends and neighbors struggled to comprehend how a man, barely known outside a small town, could take such violent action in such a short time. Morva's trial would be marked by fierce debate over his mental health. Psychiatrists testified that he suffered from a severe mental illness, a delusional disorder that distorted his sense of reality. He believed in conspiracies and imagined threats, convinced that people around him were plotting against him. His defense argued that these delusions played a central role in his actions, suggesting that he was not fully in control of his mind or capable of understanding the consequences of his behavior. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. They described Morva as dangerous, calculating, and responsible for 2 murders during his brief but violent escape. They argued that regardless of his mental state, he had committed acts that demanded the highest level of justice. The jury ultimately sided with the prosecution, sentencing him to death. Appeals and challenges citing his mental illness were rejected, and Morva remained on death row as his execution date approached. Over the years, his case attracted national attention. Mental health advocates and human rights groups raised serious concerns, arguing that executing someone with such profound mental illness was ethically questionable. They questioned whether Morva could distinguish reality from delusion and whether the state should hold him fully accountable in the same way as other inmates. These debates intensified as the execution date drew closer. On the night of his execution, the prison was quiet and tense. Witnesses, including prison officials and family members, observed the procedure. The lethal injection began, a 3-drug combination designed to first sedate, then paralyze, and finally stop the heart. Observers described Morva's stomach rising and falling in shallow waves as the chemicals coursed through his body. The moment was clinical, controlled, and yet haunting in its finality. Despite his execution, Morva's story raised broader questions about the justice system and its treatment of mentally ill offenders. Advocates argued that his delusional disorder should have spared him from the death penalty, while others maintained that the severity of his crimes justified the sentence. In the end, the state moved forward, and William Morva's life ended. His case highlighted a tension at the heart of capital punishment: how to reconcile justice for victims with mercy for those whose minds are fractured. For some, Morva's death represented a necessary enforcement of law. For others, it was a tragic failure to account for mental illness in a system that relies on absolute punishment. When the chamber emptied and the guards left, silence returned to Greensville Correctional Center. Morva's execution was over, but the moral questions lingered. Could a man with such severe delusions truly understand what he was doing? Was justice served by the state in ending his life? These questions would follow the community, the families, and advocates for years to come. The quiet finality of William Morva's execution contrasted sharply with the violent and chaotic events that had brought him there. From the hospital attack to the murder of Corporal Sutphin, every choice he made had consequences. And yet, his delusional disorder complicated the narrative, blurring the line between accountability and victimhood. His story is one of tragedy on multiple levels: for the victims' families, for a community terrified by his actions, and for Morva himself, whose mind was troubled long before he ever took a life. His execution marked the end of a controversial chapter in Virginia's history, one that sparked intense debate about the death penalty, mental illness, and the capacity of the justice system to administer punishment fairly. As the final moments of William Morva's life passed, questions remained unanswered. Could the state claim true justice when mental illness played such a critical role? Was the execution a fulfillment of law or a moral compromise? And in the larger story of Virginia's death row, what lessons should be learned about those who live in the shadow of both crime and mental disorder? The execution closed the chapter on Morva's life, but not on the conversations it ignited about ethics, law, and human frailty. His was a life marked by tragedy, violence, and debate, a life that ended in the most final way possible. Yet the questions he left behind continued to echo in the minds of all who had followed his story. Brandon Wayne Hedrick's final day came quietly, but the path that led him there was anything but calm. On July 20th, 2006, Hedrick walked into the execution chamber at Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia. The straps held him fast, the mask was placed over his eyes, and the 4 lines delivered the lethal chemicals that would end his life. He did not resist. He did not cry out. When asked if he had any final words, he shook his head. In the room, a tense silence filled the air as the state carried out its ultimate sentence. Brandon Hedrick's story begins in the small town of Danville, Virginia, where he grew up in a troubled home. His childhood was marked by neglect, poverty, and instability. Despite these hardships, he was not initially drawn to violent crime. As a young adult, he struggled to find steady employment and stability, often drifting between jobs and temporary residences. Yet beneath his quiet exterior, there was a simmering tension that would later explode into tragedy. In November 1997, Hedrick committed the crime that would change his life forever. He kidnapped, robbed, and murdered Kathy Lynn Couch, a 24-year-old woman he had no previous connection with. Hedrick later confessed that he had intended only to rob her, but the situation escalated uncontrollably. The attack ended in Couch's murder, and shortly afterward, Hedrick was apprehended. He did not attempt to flee. His cooperation with law enforcement and later confessions played a significant role during his trial. At trial, the prosecution portrayed Hedrick as cold and remorseless, arguing that his actions were premeditated and cruel. They presented evidence of the kidnapping and the planning that went into the robbery. The defense argued that Hedrick's troubled background, combined with mental health issues, contributed to his impulsive and desperate decisions. Psychologists testified that Hedrick exhibited signs of antisocial personality disorder and impulsivity, though he was not deemed legally insane. The jury ultimately sentenced him to death. During his time on death row, Hedrick maintained a demeanor of quiet introspection. He received visitors sparingly, but was known to engage with prison staff respectfully. Unlike some inmates who became infamous for escape attempts or violent outbursts behind bars, Hedrick largely stayed out of trouble in prison. He pursued programs to educate himself and reflected on his past choices, though he never denied his responsibility for the crime. As his execution date approached, Hedrick filed appeals based on the nature of his upbringing and his mental state, arguing that the combination of abuse and neglect should mitigate the severity of his punishment. The courts reviewed these appeals carefully but ultimately rejected them, affirming the death sentence. The state of Virginia was resolute. The law would be carried out, and Hedrick's life would end as dictated by the jury's decision years earlier. On the night of his execution, Hedrick's behavior reflected a mixture of resignation and calm. He met with spiritual advisors, spoke briefly with family members, and prepared for the inevitable. There were no theatrics, no dramatic last statements, just a man confronting the consequences of a single, devastating act that had ended a young woman's life and forever changed multiple families. When the lethal injection began, Hedrick's body remained still. The chemicals flowed into his bloodstream, first sedating, then paralyzing, and finally stopping his heart. Within minutes, his life ended. Witnesses described the procedure as orderly, controlled, yet profoundly somber. The execution left the room silent, the weight of the moment hanging heavily in the air. Hedrick's case became a focal point in discussions about capital punishment in Virginia. Advocates for reform highlighted his troubled childhood and the possibility that systemic neglect contributed to his path to violence. They questioned whether someone shaped by trauma and poverty could ever truly be judged solely by the crime he committed as an adult. Critics, however, argued that the brutality of his actions, kidnapping and murder, demanded the ultimate penalty, regardless of background or circumstance. In reflecting on Hedrick's story, one sees the complexity of justice and human behavior. He was not a serial killer or a repeat offender. He did not have a long history of premeditated violent acts. Yet one impulsive decision ended a life and led to his own. It is a stark reminder that violence can erupt even in seemingly ordinary lives, and that a single moment of desperation can have irreversible consequences. Brandon Hedrick's execution also contributed to the broader debate on lethal injection. At the time, the chemicals used in executions were under scrutiny for their potential to cause pain or complications. While Hedrick's execution appeared to proceed without visible difficulty, the controversy surrounding the method added to the ethical discussions surrounding capital punishment in Virginia and the United States as a whole. Hedrick's life and death raised difficult questions. How much should a troubled childhood mitigate the consequences of violent crime? Can society balance empathy for an individual shaped by trauma with justice for victims and their families? And how does the method of execution influence the perception of fairness and humanity in capital punishment? As Hedrick's body was removed from the chamber, the silence remained. There was no fanfare, no dramatic spectacle. Only the finality of a life ended, the weight of judgment carried out, and the echo of a single, terrible decision that changed everything. Brandon Hedrick's story is both tragic and cautionary. It is a narrative of personal failure, societal failure, and the harsh realities of the death penalty. It reminds us that behind every execution is a complex human story, with roots in childhood, choices, and consequences that ripple outward far beyond the prison walls. Even after his death, the case continues to resonate. Discussions about reform, mental health, and the fairness of capital punishment persist in Virginia. Hedrick's execution, like those before him, is a stark marker in the state's history of carrying out the ultimate penalty, a reminder of the moral, legal, and personal complexities that accompany death row. In the end, Hedrick's life serves as a grim illustration of how quickly one moment, one choice, can define the rest of a life. The quiet nature of his execution contrasts sharply with the violent act that put him there, emphasizing the finality of state-enforced justice and the lingering questions it leaves behind. Roger Keith Coleman's final hours came on May 20th, 1992, at the Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia. He was strapped into the electric chair, the final embodiment of the state's ultimate punishment. The execution chamber was quiet, the air tense, as he waited for the switch to be thrown. Coleman did not speak to anyone in the room. When asked if he had any last words, he remained silent. Within moments, a surge of electricity coursed through his body, and at 12:50 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Coleman's story did not begin in the execution chamber. It began with a crime that would shake the small community of Grundy, Virginia, to its core. On July 30th, 1981, a woman named Wanda McCoy was found brutally raped and murdered in her home. The crime was shocking not only for its violence, but for the seemingly random nature of the attack. Wanda was well-liked in her community, and there seemed to be no motive for such a horrendous act. Investigators combed the area for clues, questioning neighbors, friends, and family. For years, the case remained unsolved. The community lived under the shadow of fear, unsure who had committed such a violent crime. It wasn't until 1981, several months after the murder, that Roger Coleman came under suspicion. He was a local man with a criminal record and a reputation for alcohol abuse and aggression. He denied any involvement, but investigators continued to gather evidence against him. The trial became one of the most scrutinized in Virginia history. The prosecution presented DNA evidence, forensic testimony, and circumstantial evidence linking Coleman to the crime. They argued that he had attacked Wanda McCoy during a burglary, then attempted to conceal the crime. Coleman's defense challenged the DNA evidence, arguing that it was inconclusive and improperly handled. They also pointed to Coleman's troubled upbringing and lack of intent, suggesting that he could not be definitively tied to the murder. Despite these arguments, the jury convicted Coleman of capital murder and sentenced him to death. He was sent to Virginia's death row, where he would spend the next decade of his life awaiting execution. Over the years, Coleman's case became a focal point for national debate, as questions arose about the accuracy of DNA testing, the reliability of witness testimony, and the fairness of the trial process. In prison, Coleman maintained a low profile. He rarely caused disturbances and spent much of his time reading, writing letters, and reflecting on his life. He proclaimed his innocence repeatedly, asserting that he had been wrongly convicted. Advocates for Coleman took up his case, arguing that the evidence used to convict him was flawed and that his execution would be a miscarriage of justice. As his execution date approached, the state of Virginia prepared to carry out the sentence. Coleman was given the opportunity to meet with family members, spiritual advisors, and his attorneys. He used these meetings to maintain his innocence and to say farewell, although he remained quiet and reserved. The tension in the prison was palpable as the staff prepared the electric chair, an apparatus that would deliver the lethal current ending his life. When the moment came, Coleman was led into the chamber and secured in the chair. Electrodes were attached, a mask placed over his face, and the switch was thrown. Witnesses described the procedure as swift but starkly clinical. Within minutes, Coleman was pronounced dead, ending a life marked by controversy, violence, and claims of injustice. The execution sparked immediate debate. Supporters argued that justice had been served for Wanda McCoy, whose life had been taken in a brutal attack. They emphasized the importance of accountability for violent crime and the deterrent effect of the death penalty. Critics, however, highlighted concerns about DNA testing methods, potential wrongful conviction, and the irreversible nature of execution. Coleman's case became a touchstone in discussions about the death penalty, forensic science, and the potential for errors in capital cases. In the years following his execution, legal scholars and forensic experts examined Coleman's case repeatedly. Some believe that advances in DNA testing could have changed the outcome had they been available earlier. Others contended that the evidence was sufficient and that the conviction and execution were just. The case underscored the broader tension in the justice system, balancing the need for accountability with the possibility of human error. Roger Coleman's story is not just about crime and punishment. It is also about the fragility of human life, the impact of a single violent act, and the complexity of administering justice. His execution marked the end of a life shaped by both crime and controversy, but it also left lingering questions about the reliability of the justice system and the moral implications of capital punishment. Coleman's case serves as a cautionary tale. It demonstrates how one act of violence can echo through a community, leaving fear, grief, and debate in its wake. It also highlights the stakes involved in the ultimate punishment. Once an execution is carried out, there is no opportunity for correction if mistakes were made. In death, Coleman became a symbol of both justice and controversy. For the victims' families, his execution provided a measure of closure. For advocates of criminal justice reform, it represented a case that demanded scrutiny and reflection. And for the state of Virginia, it became another chapter in a long and complex history of capital punishment, one that would continue to shape policy and public opinion for years to come. Even as the electric chair went silent and the witnesses left the chamber, Coleman's story remained. The community he had terrorized, the legal battles that followed, and the debates about fairness and justice all persisted. His life and death remind us that behind every execution is a human story, fraught with complexity, tragedy, and consequences that ripple far beyond the prison walls. In the end, Roger Keith Coleman's execution was more than just the enforcement of a legal sentence. It was a reflection of the collision between human frailty and the justice system, between crime and punishment, and between the certainty of law and the uncertainty of truth. His story would be remembered not only for the crime he committed, but also for the larger questions it raised, about morality, justice, and the value of life itself. Brandon Lawrence's final day came quietly at Greensville Correctional Center, yet the story that led him there was anything but calm. On February 12, 2003, he was escorted into the execution chamber, straps securing his arms and legs, a mask covering his eyes, and 4 lines inserted to deliver the lethal chemicals. The room was tense but silent. Lawrence offered no last words, simply closing his eyes as the state carried out the sentence for crimes that had haunted the community for years. Lawrence's story began in a troubled part of Norfolk, Virginia. Growing up in poverty, he faced a childhood marked by instability, neglect, and exposure to crime. Friends and neighbors recalled a young man who often acted out, sometimes violently, but who could also be quiet and introspective. His early years hinted at a life on the edge, though no one could predict the violent path he would eventually take. In 1996, Brandon Lawrence committed the crime that would seal his fate. He participated in a violent home invasion with 2 accomplices. Their target was a family he had no personal connection with. During the robbery, Lawrence and his partners kidnapped and brutally murdered Mary Thomas, a 42-year-old woman, along with her 12-year-old son, in what the prosecution described as a cold and calculated act. The murders shocked Norfolk, leaving residents fearful and demanding justice. Lawrence was quickly apprehended. Evidence at the crime scene, including fingerprints, eyewitness accounts, and confessions from accomplices, pointed directly to him. At trial, the prosecution argued that Lawrence's actions demonstrated premeditation and a willingness to use violence to achieve his goals. The defense tried to argue that Lawrence's upbringing and exposure to abuse had contributed to his behavior, suggesting that he had been poorly guided by family and environment. The jury, however, was convinced by the prosecution's evidence. Lawrence was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Appeals citing his troubled childhood and possible mental health issues were repeatedly denied. The courts found that, while his upbringing may have influenced his character, it did not absolve him of responsibility for taking the lives of an innocent woman and her child. During his years on death row, Lawrence lived a mostly quiet life. Unlike other inmates, he avoided major disciplinary incidents and spent time reflecting on his choices. He wrote letters to family members, participated in educational programs, and occasionally met with legal representatives who continued to advocate on his behalf. Despite his efforts, the state of Virginia maintained the execution schedule. As the execution date approached, preparations were made for the lethal injection. Lawrence met with spiritual advisors, attorneys, and select family members. His demeanor remained calm and composed, a quiet acceptance of the inevitable. He showed no outward signs of fear, though the weight of his actions and their consequences surely pressed upon him. When the moment came, Brandon Lawrence was secured in the gurney. The lethal chemicals flowed into his veins, first sedating him, then paralyzing his muscles, and finally stopping his heart. Witnesses described the procedure as clinical, precise, and devoid of drama, yet the weight of a life ending for crimes committed decades earlier was palpable. Within minutes, he was pronounced dead. Lawrence's execution, like those before him, sparked reflection and debate. Supporters of capital punishment argued that justice had been served, noting the premeditated nature of his crimes and the lasting impact on the victim's family. Critics highlighted his troubled upbringing and the systemic issues that may have contributed to his behavior, questioning whether execution was the appropriate resolution for a man shaped by poverty, neglect, and exposure to violence. His case also drew attention to the broader moral and ethical questions surrounding the death penalty in Virginia. How much weight should a court give to an individual's background, mental state, or life circumstances when deciding between life and death? How can a justice system account for the cumulative effects of trauma, poverty, and neglect on criminal behavior? Lawrence's story became a reference point in ongoing debates about fairness, justice, and the human cost of capital punishment. Even in death, Brandon Lawrence's life continued to resonate. Families of victims saw closure, but the community also saw a stark reminder of how a single act of violence can devastate lives and spark years of legal and moral debate. Advocates for criminal justice reform used his case to highlight the complex interplay between environment, behavior, and punishment, while others emphasized the need for accountability and justice. Lawrence's story demonstrates the fragility of human life and the profound consequences of choices made in moments of desperation or calculated violence. A troubled upbringing, combined with a moment of deadly decision, ultimately determined the course of his life and led him to death row. His execution stands as a stark example of the ultimate punishment carried out by the state, yet it also forces society to confront uncomfortable truths about human behavior, responsibility, and justice. The finality of Lawrence's execution underscores a key reality. Behind every execution is a human story, one filled with mistakes, tragedy, and consequences that ripple far beyond the prison walls. The legal system carried out its duty, yet the questions his life raised about morality, mental health, and the fairness of capital punishment remain unresolved. As the chamber emptied and silence returned to Greensville Correctional Center, the legacy of Brandon Lawrence's life and crimes persisted. His story reminds us that the consequences of violence extend far beyond a single moment, shaping families, communities, and the very structure of the justice system. In death, he became both a cautionary tale and a symbol of the complex human realities that the death penalty cannot erase. It was a somber evening on April 19, 2018, at Greensville Correctional Center. Walter Leroy Moody Jr., strapped into the lethal injection gurney, stared at the ceiling with an expression that revealed neither fear nor defiance. The mask was lowered over his face, for lines were secured, and the room fell silent. He had no last words. The state of Virginia was about to carry out the sentence for a man whose crimes had left a permanent mark on the community, and the air in the chamber was heavy with anticipation and dread. Walter Moody's story began long before he reached the execution chamber. Born in 1935 in Rex, Georgia, he grew up in a challenging environment, shaped by poverty and a turbulent family life. As an adult, Moody's life was a series of conflicts, legal troubles, and escalating acts of violence. He had a criminal record that spanned decades, including fraud, bomb threats, and eventually, murder. Each step of his life seemed to draw him closer to the ultimate confrontation with the law. Moody's most infamous crime occurred in 1989 and 1990, when he mailed a series of explosive devices to public figures, including judges and attorneys involved in his previous legal cases. One of these bombs killed Judge Robert Vance in Alabama, while another killed attorney Robert S. Robinson in Georgia. The bombings created a climate of terror and suspicion across multiple states, marking Moody as one of the most calculated and dangerous criminals in the region. Investigators painstakingly traced the bombs back to Moody through forensic evidence, fingerprints, and meticulous analysis of the materials he used. He was arrested, and the scope of his crimes became fully clear. Moody's deliberate targeting of judges and attorneys demonstrated not only his criminal intent, but also a disturbing desire for revenge against the legal system he believed had wronged him. His trial was lengthy and complex. The prosecution presented compelling evidence of Moody's responsibility for the bombings, emphasizing the premeditated nature of his actions and the lethal consequences of his devices. The defense argued that Moody's advanced age, mental state, and declining health should be considered in sentencing. They claimed that while he was responsible for the crimes, execution was too severe a punishment for a man in his 80s. Despite these arguments, the jury found Moody guilty and sentenced him to death. Appeals followed, but the courts consistently upheld the verdict. By the time of his execution, Moody was 83 years old, making him the oldest inmate executed in the United States in decades. His age did not mitigate the severity of his crimes in the eyes of the state. During his years on death row, Moody remained a controversial figure. He engaged with the media, writing letters and giving interviews where he alternately admitted and deflected responsibility for certain actions. Some saw him as manipulative and unrepentant. Others viewed him as a complex figure whose grievances with the legal system had escalated into horrific acts of violence. On the night of his execution, Moody met with spiritual advisors and legal representatives. He appeared calm, almost detached, as if resigned to his fate. When led into the execution chamber, he lay on the gurney without resistance, the straps securing his arms and legs, the mask covering his eyes, the 4 lines ready. The lethal injection began, and within minutes, Walter Leroy Moody Jr. was pronounced dead. The execution sparked intense public discussion. Supporters argued that justice had been served, noting that Moody had deliberately killed 2 people and endangered countless others with his bombs. They emphasized that age should not protect someone from the consequences of premeditated murder. Critics, however, highlighted Moody's advanced age and questioned whether execution of an elderly inmate served justice or merely fulfilled retribution. His case became a reference point in broader debates about the death penalty, particularly regarding elderly inmates and the ethics of executing individuals who may be physically frail. Moody's story is a stark reminder of the consequences of obsession, vengeance, and escalating criminal behavior. His early life of hardship and conflict did not excuse the deliberate targeting and killing of innocent people. The meticulous planning behind the bombings reflected a cold, calculated mind, and the terror inflicted upon communities extended far beyond the immediate victims. His execution also underscored the tension between legal justice and ethical considerations. How should society handle aging criminals on death row? Is it the severity of the punishment or the accountability for the act that defines justice? Walter Moody's case brought these questions to the forefront, illustrating the complexities of capital punishment in a modern justice system. Even after his death, the legacy of Walter Moody Jr. continued. The families of his victims felt a measure of closure, yet the broader questions about morality, retribution, and the limits of justice lingered. His life and execution serve as a cautionary tale of how personal grievances, when left unchecked, can escalate into crimes with devastating consequences. Moody's story also highlights the extraordinary lengths the justice system will go to ensure accountability. The careful investigation, the trials, the appeals, and finally the execution demonstrate a legal process designed to weigh evidence, consider mitigating factors, and ultimately enforce the law. Yet the moral complexities remain, prompting reflection on whether the ultimate punishment can ever fully reconcile justice with humanity. As the execution chamber emptied and silence returned to Greensville Correctional Center, the weight of Moody's crimes and the finality of his punishment remained palpable. His life, marked by violence, revenge, and obsession, had ended in the state's ultimate sentence. Yet the questions it raised, about justice, morality, and the human capacity for destruction, persisted far beyond the walls of the prison. Walter Leroy Moody Jr.'s story, like those of the other inmates chronicled in this series, reminds us that the death penalty is never just a legal procedure. It is a reflection of society's values, fears, and ethical boundaries. Each execution carries with it not only the weight of the crime committed, but also the moral responsibility of those who administer the ultimate punishment. In the end, Moody's life and death stand as both a warning and a reflection. A warning of how vengeance, obsession, and unresolved grievances can escalate into tragedy, and a reflection on the profound questions surrounding capital punishment, questions that will continue to challenge society, lawmakers, and the justice system for generations to come. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.